Hey, biology students. In this new lecture series, we are discussing the theory of evolution. Now, in this cartoon, we have the guy here saying, "Don't call it evolution." The little guy in back gets offended. Well, I start with this cartoon every semester because I realize for many non-scientists, the theory of evolution is controversial and maybe even offensive. And I like to be really clear and upfront that my goal is obviously not to be offensive to you, regardless of your religious viewpoints. So, over the years, some students have asked me, why don't you talk about creationism or the Judeo Christian viewpoint? The reason is that this is a college level class on biology. I have utmost respect for the world religions. However, I am not an expert on world religions, and this is not a class on world religions. And so my expertise is in science, and that is the perspective you are going to hear in these lectures. And as we move forward with the remainder of the semester, we will be discussing the theory of evolution from the scientific perspective. Please note, this does not have to be your perspective. At the end of the day, what you believe or not believe is your choice. And so please don't feel like you have to abandon your religious viewpoints in order to understand the concepts that we will be describing in this new lecture series. And I do also like to let you know that many scientists still believe in God and have religious viewpoints that are that actually can blend with the theory of evolution. And many world religious leaders have made that very clear to their followers. For example, the Pope has made it very clear to Catholics that theory of evolution and Catholic teaching is compatible belief system. So you don't have to reject it, but you certainly don't have to feel like I'm pushing you towards what you don't want to believe or not believe. For the purpose of this class, though, I do expect that you understand the principles of the theory of evolution and that you're able to be tested on that and understand that. Okay? So with that out of the way, let's get started. So a lot of people don't understand what we mean by the term evolution. And really, the term evolution really means change. It's really change over time. So I like to start with an example of something that we have seen evolve over our lifetimes. And that is the evolution of the cell phone. So although probably most of you grew up with cell phones, back in the old days, probably early 90s, this was the original cell phone. It was huge and bulky, and this would not be something you would fit in your pocket. But the next version of that, the next change, the evolution of the next cell phone was something similar to this, the little Nokia phones. Now this was around this is when I remember cell phones starting to become popular. And I remember I got a Nokia phone, and texting was just becoming a thing. And I couldn't figure out why anybody would text, because this was back when you had to push all the buttons, one at a time, over and over until you got to the letter that you wanted, and you kept having to do that. It would take forever to text, and I just thought to myself, why is anybody texting? I don't understand why anyone would do that. Then there was the flip phone. Remember that? You might even know some people that still have flip phones. I know my grandparents finally just gave up their flip phones, but there was the flip phone model. And then, of course, our beloved smartphones, our iPhones that really revolutionized cell phone technology. So this concept of evolution just means a change, okay, a change in form that has occurred over many generations. So here we're seeing generations of technology, generations of cell phones. Let's apply that principle to how it relates to biological systems. So we use this term biological evolution, and here's how I would like us to define it for the purposes of our class. So I'd like to define it as a change in the inherited characteristics of a population over time. That is the definition of biological evolution. So notice it also refers to a change, just like we talked about the change in the different cell phone models over the last 30 years or so. Very important though, the term inherited. So these inherited characteristics, what do we mean by that? Well, we mean that these are traits that are encoded in the DNA of the organism. So in order for biological evolution to work, this has to be at the gene level, the DNA level, okay? So it can't be characteristics that we acquire during our life. So we can pass on the instruction book written in our gamete cells, but if you decide to dye your hair blue, that is an acquired characteristic, and obviously that wouldn't pass on to your offspring. Now that seems sort of obvious, but we will look at some scientists in the early days of trying to understand how evolution worked, and they actually made that error in their thinking. They didn't realize that it had to be encoded in the DNA. It had to be inherited. The other important part of this definition is that we're dealing with populations. So when we discuss the evolutionary process, this is something that occurs in populations. We look at the frequency or the percentage of certain characteristics within a population. We don't look at that in terms of individuals. So in just single generations where individuals show changes to their phenotypes, that would not qualify as the definition of biological evolution. We need to see broad sweeping changes in many individuals within a population rather than single individuals. And then the other important part of this is the over time part. The point being that evolution doesn't happen in a single generation, even in many or a few generations. It's many, many generations. Now, for some single-celled organisms like bacteria, that can be a relatively short amount of time, and the reason is that bacteria reproduce, in some cases, every 20 minutes. So their generation time is very short. And so it's possible to see the biological evolution of microorganisms in a short amount of time. But for large organisms, especially animals, and especially in humans, this is going to take many generations, thousands of years, sometimes millions of years before we're able to see these changes take effect within a full population. Okay, let's talk historically about evolution. Now, you may know the founder of modern evolutionary theory is Charles Darwin, but he actually wasn't the first person to realize that organisms could change over time, but he was the first person that got it right in terms of how evolution works. So first, let's talk about how evolution does not work. So this scientist, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, lived in the early 1800s, and he was on the right track in terms of he understood that there could be changes in populations that could accumulate over time, but his mechanism was flawed. So, for example, he thought that the giraffe got its long neck from the use or the need for that neck to be long. In other words, in order to reach the tall leaves on the top of trees to reach that food source, he thought, over time they must have just stretched their neck in order to reach the tall trees. And this is actually obviously not how it works. So this is false. So it is possible, of course, in science for false information to initially be described and then later discredited. And that is definitely the case with Lamarckian understanding of evolution. This is not how it works. So, in fact, Charles Darwin had read some of Lamarck's works, and he called his work absolute rubbish, meaning that this is obviously not what happens. We can't make ourselves change our phenotypes. We can't stretch our arms or stretch our legs or stretch our necks in response to environmental conditions. That's not how it works. And in fact, he called it the theory of acquired characteristics, that we would acquire characteristics during our lifetime, like stretching your neck, and that would be inherited. And obviously that's not how it works. So along comes Charles Darwin. I want to tell you about his story here. What's significant about Charles Darwin is that he's the first person to publish a book on the theory of evolution with a mechanism of how evolution happens that he called natural selection. He actually wasn't the first person to even come up with the concept of natural selection, and somebody almost beat him to the prize of gaining recognition for that, and that was the scientist Alfred Russel Wallace, who actually wrote to Charles Darwin and had come up with the same idea. Charles Darwin said, "Oh shoot, I better publish this." So they published a joint essay, but then Charles Darwin published his very famous book on the origin of species, published in 1859. Now here's a picture of Charles Darwin in his older age, looking a little bit like Santa Claus, okay? But I'd rather talk to you about Charles Darwin in his younger days. So here's a picture of Charles Darwin in his early 20s. Charles Darwin came from a very wealthy family in England where his father was a medical doctor and his grandfather was a medical doctor. And it was understood that Charles Darwin would follow in the family footsteps and he would also become a medical doctor. So he attended medical school in England and he hated it. You have to understand, in the early 1800s, this was a very difficult time to be in medicine because people didn't understand how infectious disease worked. They didn't understand microscopic germs. For example, surgery was a spectator sport. If you can imagine, you could go and watch surgeries in an arena, sort of like we go for, watching a basketball game. You could watch in a stadium surgery. And of course, there was no sterile technique. The doctors, the surgeons were using the same bloody and gory utensils on everybody. There was no sterile operating rooms, like there is today. So infection was rampant, and it was a really terrifying time in medicine. And Charles Darwin wanted nothing to do with that. So he dropped out of school. He moved back in with his parents. To their horror and to their shame, he wasn't following in the family footsteps. And they said, well, if you're not going to be a medical doctor, the other respectable thing to be would to be a priest in the Church of England, to be an Anglican priest. And Charles Darwin was actually deeply religious, and he considered that. But right around this time, he learned of a job opening. In the job opening, by coincidence, somebody had dropped out, somebody who was going to serve the job of naturalist on the HMS Beagle, a ship that would go on a 5-year journey around the world. And this person had dropped out, and they were looking for a naturalist to go on a 5-year journey around the world. Reflect on that a minute. I know a lot of you are in your 20s, and without having, a spouse or children to look after, think about that. If somebody said, would you like to go on a 5-year journey around the world? That might be actually pretty desirable. And Charles Darwin thought so as well. To be a naturalist meant to take record what he saw on this journey, including taking specimens of animals and plants, and also rocks and things like that they would find on this journey. So here's where they go. They leave obviously from England, and they follow this path here as they go around the tip of South America. And you may know, if you know anything about Charles Darwin, he really had a fondness for these collection of islands off the coast of Ecuador, and very famous. These are called the Galapagos. So he spent a lot of time there. And then they left the Galapagos and they went up around Australia, around the tip of Africa, and back up to England. And this was very cool because nobody had seen these places before. And that's a very rare thing in today, isn't it? There's very few places today in the world that there isn't a huge human influence, where people have been there already. Charles Darwin had this unique opportunity to go to places around the world that people had never been before, and to see things that nobody had ever seen before. If you've ever had the opportunity to travel just in your lifetime so far, say go to other countries, other parts of the world, maybe some of you are military and you've been to the Middle East and you've seen what that is like. Those sorts of experiences, they change you. They change your perspective, and it certainly changed Darwin's perspective, because the perspective of the scientific community at this time was very much the perspective of the book of Genesis in the Christian Bible. And what the book of Genesis implied was that life on the planet had been created in about 7 days by God, and that life hadn't changed at all since that time. And it was also proposed that the Earth was relatively young, maybe just a few thousand years old. But what Charles Darwin observed on his 5-year voyage around the world really got him thinking about that, and realizing that didn't make sense with what he was seeing around the world. So he witnessed major geographical changes, major storms and tsunamis and droughts and floods, and all of these environmental changes that would occur in these places. And then noticing that the organisms, the plants and the animals that lived there, were well adapted or would change along with the environment. On the Galapagos, there's a lot of really cool animals to understand. I particularly love the tortoises, and I know Charles Darwin did as well. One of the cool things about these tortoises on the different islands along the Galapagos, so there's several different islands that make up the Galapagos, is that each island has a unique species of tortoise with unique adaptations in form, so unique phenotypes. So take a look at these two tortoises, and you notice that the tortoise on the right, this tortoise comes from Pinta Island. And you'll notice that the tortoises on Pinta Island, they have very long necks. See that? Look how long that neck is. Well, that's because there's not a lot of vegetation on Pinta Island, and it's a huge advantage if you have a long neck and you can reach vegetation that is higher up off of the ground. Compare that to the tortoise on the left. The tortoise on the left comes from Santa Cruz Island, one of the Galapagos Islands. Notice that they have very short necks. That's because there's a lot of vegetation. You can see how green it is there on Santa Cruz Island. So you don't need to have a super long neck in order to reach vegetation, because low to the ground is fine. And also there's a lot more predators on Santa Cruz Island. And so if you had a long neck, it would be easier for a predator to grab your neck and devour you. So having a short neck is what we call an adaptation. So it's an adaptation to have a short neck on Santa Cruz Island, but the reverse is true on Pinta Island. It's a better adaptation to have a longer neck. So the question here is really, how did these neck lengths become so variable among these tortoise populations? Because it wasn't Lamarckian's theory of acquired characteristics. Remember, he would say, well, it's because they must have stretched and that's how they got that. Well, that's not how it works. So Charles Darwin returns from his trip, and he returns from his trip in 1836. Notice, though, when he actually publishes his very famous book on the origin of species, he publishes his book in 1859. It took him 23 years to finally publish this book. Why was that? Well, when he returned from his trip, he was still a young man in his 20s, and he realized that the ideas that he had were revolutionary and were going to shake the world of biology, and were going to be highly unpopular, almost like a heretic situation. And he was actually afraid. He was afraid to publish his ideas, and it took him 23 years of careful planning, careful writing, careful research. He wanted to make sure that he was right about this before he put himself on the line. And he wanted to be careful about that, because historically, if you know anything about historical science, scientists, like if you know Galileo, the story of Galileo, the scientist who proposed that the solar system centered around the sun instead of the earth, which we now know is correct, but that was heresy, and he was thrown in jail by the Catholic Church. So scientists were hesitant to refute popular opinion because of the fear of being punished. So he wanted to make sure he was absolutely correct about this. And the amazing thing of what he came up with here in his book is that it has stood the test of time, the test of modern science. And he recognized this pattern, and he describes it, and he calls it natural selection. And everything we know in biology supports this mechanism. Now, it's not the only mechanism for how evolution works. So in the next lecture video, we will be discussing other mechanisms for how evolution can occur in populations, but it certainly is a major mechanism for how evolution works. So let's get to explaining how that works. So Charles Darwin, by the way, so he was concerned about how the Royal Society of London, this elite group of scientists, would view his book. So in the beginning of his book, he actually describes a concept that everybody understood, because everybody had been doing this for thousands of years, and it's called selective breeding. Now, we've talked about this. We talked about it in the GMO lecture, because I make the connection that what we've been doing in farming for thousands of years is really the same thing that we're doing now in a more targeted approach in GMO organisms. But the concept is that farming is really not natural. It involves the breeder or the farmer taking animals with particular traits and breeding those animals so that their offspring have those traits. We've talked about this. Remember the Belgian blue cattle? So how did these cattle get so big and beefy? Well, it's because they were bred where the beefiest cattle were crossbred, and that yielded beefy offspring. And then those were crossbred. And after many generations, you get this line of cattle that overproduces muscle, have large muscles, and look like this, okay? How about award-winning horses? So if you have a horse that wins in the Kentucky Derby, you can sell the sperm of that horse for many thousands of dollars people will pay, because it's understood that if you have an award-winning horse that's particularly fast at racing, that potentially could be genetic, and they'd want that sperm so they could breed more horses with that trait. Breeds of dogs. So all of the different breeds of dogs, that is not natural. That is a result of us, of humans. We select for traits, coat color, appearance, length of the legs, and all of these things that we think are desirable, and we crossbreed these dogs. And a lot of that involves inbreeding, by the way, breeding brother and sister dogs to get these desired phenotypes. It's also, on a side note, one of the reasons why certain breeds of dogs have some genetic problems. It's because in the process of selectively breeding them for what the breeder thought was a desirable trait, they had to inbreed those dogs. And when you breed brother and sister, that increases the probability of homozygous recessive mutations showing up. And so a lot of them have other types of health problems because of that process. Now, this is not just unique to livestock and to animals. This is also true in plants. We've talked about this before, but that all of these vegetables you see on the screen here, from broccoli to cabbage to cauliflower to kale, that is also a result of selective breeding. So they all come from the wild mustard plant. And so, 10,000 years ago, we're breeding wild mustard, different varieties of the mustard plant to get this desirable outcome. And so he starts his book by helping everybody understand, we've been doing this selective breeding for thousands of years. It's called farming. We also call it artificial selection. You should be familiar with that term. It's called artificial selection. And that's because humans, the breeder or the farmer, is acting as the selecting agent, as opposed to what natural selection involves, which is the environment selecting for a specific trait. So he makes this connection for people in the book. He says, we've been doing this process artificially for thousands of years. Everybody knows if you crossbreed two animals with a particular trait, and their offspring have that trait, and then their offspring have that trait, now we've changed the characteristics of that population. We've evolved that population, but in an artificial way, in a way that we designed. He said, well, if this can happen in farming, couldn't this happen just on its own in nature, with environmental changes? Could those environmental changes drive this process? Let's take a look at a paragraph from his famous book on the origin of species, where he describes natural selection. He says, as many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as consequently there is a frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any being, if it vary, however slightly, in any manner profitable to itself, under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected. From the strong principle of inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form. Now that's 1859. He is a very eloquent writer, but this is obviously written in the language of the 1800s, so maybe it's not entirely relatable to you. But there are some key terms that I think are important to understand. He understands that there are more individuals than can possibly survive. There's something he coins this term struggle for existence. There's this competition among organisms. And then some happen to have a better chance of surviving and thus are naturally selected. So we're going to break this down into the key points about natural selection. So the first thing to understand, and Charles Darwin understood this as well, is that in every population there is variety. More often in sexually reproducing organisms than in asexually reproducing organisms. And that's simply because of the process of meiosis, right? That leads to the scrambling of the DNA in every generation. But look around. There's variety, isn't there? Everywhere you look. Here we see different bunnies with different coat colors. The amazing thing to me, Charles Darwin, of course, recognized that variation had to be present in order for natural selection to occur. But the amazing thing to me is that he publishes his book in 1859. Now, he was actually contemporaries with Gregor Mendel, the founding father of the field of genetics. However, they never knew of each other, because back then, of course, there was no social media, there wasn't cross collaboration between scientists in other parts of the world like there is today. And so he did not know anything of what Gregor Mendel was doing. He didn't know, Charles Darwin knew nothing about DNA, what DNA was and how it worked. Boy, that wouldn't be understood for another 100 years after Charles Darwin. But the amazing thing to me is that he figured this out without knowing anything about what Mendel was figuring out with how heredity works, and without knowing anything about DNA. And he was right on. And with modern technology and modern biology, everything is exactly the way he predicted it. So today we now know, he didn't know this, but we now know that mutations occur in the DNA. And this produces new alleles. And when we get new alleles, that can lead to variation. That can lead to new traits. Genetic variation is also a result of meiosis. If you got anything out of meiosis, hopefully you got the point across that due to crossing over, that special event in prophase 1 where the homologous pairs, they swap segments. And remember, that's the way we make the chromosomes sort of multicolored, looking at that point to sort of model that they're swapping large segments of chromosome with their homologous partner chromosomes. And then the shuffling of the chromosomes that occurs in independent assortment, where there's all these possibilities of which chromosomes will actually be separated into the gamete cells. So there's all of this shuffling, and there's the mutation that occurs within chromosomes, and all of that is very important to the process of natural selection and occurs randomly, okay? So natural selection is the process that acts on that variation. Very simply, take a look at this picture. Here we're looking at these two different variants of caterpillars. So they have two different phenotypes, right? So we've got the green caterpillars and we've got the blue caterpillars, and they're both happily eating their green leaves. But along comes a predator, a bird. Bird comes along, and you can see that the bird is eating the blue caterpillar. Why did the bird select for the blue caterpillar rather than the green? Well, it's because the green caterpillar is better camouflaged, isn't it? The camouflaged green caterpillar blends in with its environment and is less likely to be eaten. So we use this term selecting agent or selection pressure to describe what can happen in the environment. So remember, the natural selection process refers to what happens in the environment when there is variety of phenotype and depending on the environment, there can be a pressure that can select for a particular phenotype. So what are some examples of selecting agents or selection pressures that we see in nature? Well, what's described in this picture is predation. So when there's a predator that's out to eat you, and if you have some adaptation that allows you to survive that predator, maybe it's just camouflage like we see here with the caterpillars, now you have an adaptation. So we would say that the phenotype of being green is an adaptation in this particular environment. And we would say the selection pressure here would be predation by the birds. Okay, other types of selecting agents or selective pressure, things that can occur in nature. So things like shortages of food or shelter. So again, things where certain organisms will survive, or if you have that long neck, right, you can reach the food, and those with the short neck, they can't, and they die off, and you survive, and you reproduce, and you pass on that trait. There we go. Now we have a selection process. Things like disease can be a selecting pressure. So disease that wipes out certain groups of organisms, and other organisms that have a better adapted immune system, perhaps, they survive. Things like poisons. Poisons can be selective pressures because it can kill off certain groups of organisms, and other organisms with an adaptation would survive. Competition, simply other types of competition. And going back to what Charles Darwin referred to, he referred to this process of natural selection, he referred to it as this struggle for existence. He said there would be a struggle for existence in nature, that there's going to be competition, there's going to be environmental shortages, there's going to be disease, there's going to be predators, and if you have that advantageous trait, you are going to be more likely to outcompete others in the particular environment. I thought I would show you a simulation on this process. Let's take a look. Okay, so I found this simulation of the process of natural selection I wanted to share with you. And here we see this little white bunny here, and the environment gives us this very brown, they actually call it the equator environment, so in a warm climate environment. Now it says add a friend because he needs a friend here. So now there's two bunnies, two white bunnies, and bunnies will do what bunnies do, which is they'll reproduce, okay, and they'll start making more white bunnies, because this is an inherited characteristic to be a white bunny. And this will happen in bunnies really fast. And Charles Darwin noted this, that in every population there's sort of this overproduction. But we're not just overrun with bunnies, are we? Right now it looks like we're overrun with bunnies. Well, what happens if we introduce some wolves into our population? Well, the wolves are going to start cutting down on this bunny population. But let's go ahead and introduce a mutation into the population, and the mutation now codes for brown fur. So now the wolves are in there and they're still eating the bunnies, but notice that the wolves are eating, in preference, they're eating the white bunnies compared to the brown bunnies. It's that same story like with the caterpillars, where if you have the ability to camouflage in your environment, you're better adapted. So over time, what we begin to see is selection caused by the predation of wolves for the brown bunny compared to the white bunny. And over many generations, we see that white bunny trait start to disappear in the population, and we have now more brown bunnies. But notice what happens if we shift to the Arctic, okay? So change the environment, and now, boy, those brown bunnies, they really stand out, don't they? And the wolves come in, and now who are the wolves going to eat? Well, they're going to eat the brown bunnies, and they're going to leave the white bunnies alone because the white bunnies are better adapted in this particular environment. The white bunnies are better adapted. And so the wolves come in and they take down the brown bunny population. Now there's other adaptation. Remember, there's other selection factors or selecting agents. Let's put food in there. Put some food. Food is pretty scarce. And now let's change a mutation. We'll give long teeth to some of the bunnies. All right, here's a long-toothed bunny here, and a long-toothed bunny. There's brown and then there's white long-toothed bunnies. So what happens is this long-toothed bunny is better adapted for getting the food compared to the short-toothed bunny. And what happens is over time, we see more of the long-toothed bunny than the short-toothed bunny. So now we have a different type of selective pressure, this time food rather than predators. So food source can also select for certain traits to become more common in a population. So two more important characteristics to add to your understanding of natural selection. So the first thing to understand is that this refers to certain genetically controlled phenotypes that are more advantageous in a specific environment. So it really depends on the environment, and that individuals with these advantageous traits, they are more likely to survive, to reproduce, and to pass on those traits. We can also look at this graphically. Let's go back to the caterpillar example. So if there's no selection, we really wouldn't see a big difference in the numbers of blue caterpillars compared to green caterpillars. But in the right graph, what would we predict here after selection, pressure of predation over many generations? Remember, that's an important principle, is that it's over many generations, several generations, we start to see a change in the inherited characteristics. And remember, that's how we're defining evolution, is a change in the inherited characteristics. So several generations later, the blue caterpillars are in the decline. Maybe they even go extinct, where green caterpillars are increasing or staying stable in the population. And the reason being would be natural selection. This wouldn't be just random chance, okay? This would actually be because the green coloration is an adaptation in this particular environment where selection, pressure of predation is acting on the population. So let's summarize natural selection of what we've learned today. So we've learned that in order for natural selection to occur, there has to be mutation. And mutation actually causes populations to have phenotypic variation, or what we call genetic variation. And as a result of mutation, we end up with new traits in that population. And then if a particular trait is advantageous over another, then we get natural selection. And if that particular trait becomes common in the population over many generations, then we say we have evolution. We have a change in the characteristics of that population. I thought we could apply natural selection to one more example before we go. And this is related to a topic that I particularly enjoy learning about myself because my background is in microbiology, and this is a very important problem in the medical community right now. And the problem is antibiotic resistance. Now, I mention this because although, like we said in the beginning of the video, you can decide whether or not you choose to believe or not believe in certain concepts in biology, and evolution being one of those, I do think there is a fallacy to saying, oh, I believe in evolution or I don't believe in evolution, because evolution to scientists, you see, it's not a belief. It's based on evidence. Evolution is based on evidence. So I wouldn't say, personally, I wouldn't say I believe in evolution. I would say I accept the theory of evolution based on the evidence. And so sometimes I do find it interesting when people say, oh, I don't believe in evolution. It doesn't happen. Natural selection is not happening. And I say, really? Well, wouldn't that be nice? Because if there was no such thing as evolution, there wouldn't be antibiotic resistance. And this is a huge problem, a huge reality in medicine. And what this literally means, what this means is that the medications that we use to treat bacterial infections are not working on the bacterial pathogens. And the reason is that the pathogens are evolving. Let's take, for example, tuberculosis. So tuberculosis disease is caused by a bacterium that's called Mycobacterium. Okay, so Mycobacterium causes the disease. Tuberculosis, we'll just write it as TB disease. These are the bacterial cells. You see they look sort of like these, sort of look like Tic Tacs. They're very small. They get into the lungs and they cause a major disease in the lungs, where when you look at people who have tuberculosis on chest x-ray, it's just what a chest x-ray looks like for somebody with tuberculosis. You see all that white stuff in there. That's not a good thing. When you take a chest x-ray of somebody, you should just be seeing black in the lungs on the x-ray, because there should just be air in there in your lungs. There shouldn't be pus and all of this growth of bacteria. This is what we see in tuberculosis when we have a patient with this disease. And they are very, very sick, and they'll be coughing up blood and all sorts of things. Well, since the advent of antibiotics around World War II, a lot of bacterial infections we were able to cure them using antibiotics. But resistance means that the antibiotics are no longer effective on the bacterial populations. And why would that be? Well, it's because of evolution. So let's spell it out for you here. The 4 major points to understand when it comes to natural selection. These are the 4 things that you should understand in order for evolution by natural selection to occur. Number 1, there's mutations. So in this case, we're talking about mutations in bacteria. So let's say that we have a population of bacteria. Remember, they're sort of this rod shape, or sort of look like Tic Tacs. So you have this population of bacterial cells, but an occasional bacterial cell will have a mutation, just like we see in other populations as well. So we can have a mutation in one particular cell, for example. This leads to a new trait. So if this particular mutation causes this bacteria to be resistant to the antibiotic, we would say that is an adaptation when we treat a patient with an infection and we treat them with antibiotics. So what would happen would be that struggle for existence, that selection process. In this case, we would say the selecting agent would be the antibiotics. So if we treat the patient with antibiotics, those antibiotics will kill this red bacteria and this red bacteria and this red bacteria, because we would say they are susceptible to the antibiotics, and the antibiotics successfully kill those bacteria. But this resistant bacteria persists in the population. And what's going to happen? Well, he doesn't have to compete with any of these red bacteria anymore. He's got plenty of room to grow. He's got the whole lungs to himself, and he's just going to say, great, I'm just going to start growing in the lungs. And so what is he going to do? Well, he's going to divide, okay? So he's going to divide quickly. He's going to make a whole bunch of offspring that are identical to him. And we would say now these resistant bacteria are selected for. And now we have the fourth principle here, which would be evolution, survival and reproduction of the fittest. So the resistant bacteria are free to divide. They will form many resistant, identical resistant cells, and the population has evolved. And so in bacteria, because they reproduce so quickly, this can happen very, very quickly. And we can end up with populations of tuberculosis bacteria that cannot be effectively killed by the antibiotics that we have available to us. And this is a huge problem because it means that the bacteria win the infection. Lastly, let's talk about some misconceptions about natural selection. Hopefully you don't fall into any of these misconception traps on the exam. For example, we do not say that organisms develop new traits as a result of a selection pressure, because remember, that's a false explanation. That was like the Lamarckian view of evolution, which we now know is not how it works. In other words, the giraffes, they can't stretch their necks to reach the leaves up high. They're not developing their traits. And that is a very common misconception I see among students, where they'll say, oh, well, the organism adapted or they developed this trait. The word develop is not the right word to use. You want to use the word evolve. Okay, they evolve these traits. And how does that work? Well, we learned today that natural selection is one of the ways that that works. But important to notice that natural selection is not creating any new alleles. What creates new alleles? That's mutation. Mutation creates new alleles. And this occurs before the selection pressure. So the better way to describe what happened in the evolution of the giraffe would be this. Some giraffes, as a result of random mutation, had longer necks than other giraffes. So there was genetic variation in the population of giraffes. Some had long necks, some had short necks. And those with long necks were selected for as a result of the selection pressure of food shortage, that you needed to reach the food that was up high. So if you happened to have a long neck, you would survive better than your short-necked giraffe competitors, and then you would pass on that trait to your offspring. And over time, we would see more long-necked giraffes being born than short-necked giraffes. And then the population over many generations would shift in the characteristics, and we would say the population evolved. The third major misconception I want to get across is that a particular genetic trait is not favorable in every environment. So hopefully you got that across with the bunny simulation. For example, white bunnies are better adapted in the Arctic when they live in the snow and they can camouflage than brown bunnies. But in the desert environment, the brown bunnies were better adapted. So you can't make a blanket statement like being a brown colored bunny is always going to be the advantageous trait. It's only in that particular environment is that an advantageous trait. So those are some misconceptions that I hope you understand. And I hope you understand the mechanism of natural selection, which is the major mechanism for how evolution works.